How well do you know Dauphin Island? There's always another story waiting just beneath the surface, and the growing Dauphin Island Diaries catalog explores everything from Fort Gaines and the island's ancient shell mounds to Sand Island Lighthouse, Alabama's artificial reefs, and the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. You'll also find full-length conversations with island personalities like Sherry Pope Moon, Anita Phillips, and Connie Roan, along with subject matter experts like Jason Herman and Mike Bunn, and new episodes and interviews are added every month. Follow Dauphin Island Diaries in your favorite podcast app, then explore the catalog and discover another story from the island, the bay, and the Gulf Coast. Now, let's get into the story. Welcome to Dauphin Island Diaries. This is a podcast dedicated to the history of Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, and the Gulf Coast that surrounds it. Twice each month, we bring you a story about the people, the places, and the moments that have shaped this island, and the waters and coastline beyond it. Some of these stories are well known. Others have been buried by time and storms and shifting shorelines, but they're still here. So wherever you are, whether you're on the island, remembering it, or discovering it for the first time, find a comfortable place, take a deep breath, relax, and settle in, because this is one of those stories. Young Marie Briard was cautiously excited. Cautiously. She was going to meet her husband. She'd left France over 3 months ago for the journey to her new home, and though she'd been excited for this grand adventure, there was also a great deal of anxiety when they'd boarded the Pelican in Rochefort back in mid-April, knowing this well could be the last time she'd ever see her friends, her family, and indeed, even France. She and the other girls had been promised a paradise in the New World, but they'd begun hearing rumors that the men that they were to wed were Canadians. When this all started and they were being assured of marrying good, solid Frenchmen, that was one thing. But Canadians? Good heavens, no. Let it not be so. But as soon as they'd started hearing these rumors, Mademoiselle Boisrenaud had started keeping a much closer eye on them, and Father Levant had ensured that they were kept confined closer to their quarters and not permitted so readily to mingle with others in the area. Marie treasured her cassette. Before they'd left France, each of the girls had received a small wooden chest, a cassette, with a few personal items that she'd need as she entered her new life. Marie had placed some of her own personal items in hers, remnants of the life in France she was leaving behind her as she sailed to what awaited her in the New World, and it really was about the only personal possession she'd had room for in the cramped quarters aboard the Pelican. After almost 2 months at sea, what a relief it had been finally to make landfall, even if they hadn't been permitted to go ashore. But then came Cuba. What a relief after so long aboard the ship in those cramped quarters. And they'd all been beset with seasickness. It was horrible. But then Havana was wonderful. They'd finally been permitted to go ashore there and had spent a week in the Spanish colonial city. It was smaller than the cities of Europe to which they were accustomed, but nevertheless, the Bishop of Cuba had been a marvelous host and had entertained them and guided them around Havana. But the mosquitoes, there were so many of them in Havana, and at night those had descended upon them in humming masses, and the bites were so irritating. But then they'd had to go back aboard the Pelican, which was horribly cramped, and Captain Ducadre had strictly charged that they stay in their quarters, and Mademoiselle Boisrenaud and Father Levant had continued to keep them separated from the crew and other passengers. But at least the remaining journey was much shorter than the passage from Rochefort to Cap-Français. They'd had a brief stop near a place called Pensacola, then arrived at Massacre Island within just over a week after leaving Cuba. And some of the girls began getting sick. So much sicker than before. Monsieur Lesueur had been left behind at Havana with the same illness. One of the officers aboard the ship had died at sea and was buried at sea. It had been so sad. The fever, they'd never seen anything like it. Mon Dieu, they prayed for deliverance from this plague. Marie had dearly hoped that Massacre Island wasn't as ominous as the name sounded, but it had unfortunately proven to be rather primitive. And the name had also proven to be a bad omen. By the time they'd arrived there, nearly 60 soldiers and crewmen were sick with the fever, and over the next few days, over a dozen had died. Poor Louise Francois Lefebvre had become so sick, but she wasn't the only one of the girls. Because the Pelican's draft was too deep for La Mobile, the Mobile River, they'd had to make the 16-league journey from Massacre Island to Fort Louis in barks. Things weren't getting any better yet, but they were still hopeful. But their hopes were becoming more and more difficult to maintain. And then 27 Mile Bluff and Fort Louis came into sight, and their hopes were dashed. They'd been lied to. This was not the Garden of Eden they'd been promised. After the burdens of the journey and the illness and the fatigue that was on them, which was all endured for the coming paradise, only for it to be this words failed Marie. But the die was cast. There was no going back. This was to be their home and their future, if there was any future to be had in this place. Marie would have to find her husband and make the best of what she'd been given. This is a fictionalized account of what it may have felt like for young Marie Briard as she arrived in the predecessor of Mobile, Fort Louis on 27 Mile Bluff in 1704. Marie did indeed find her husband. She was courted by Antoine Rivard de la Vigne, a Canadian merchant of comparatively good means. They executed a marriage contract containing property and inheritance provisions. They were among the first 13 couples married by August 17, 1704. Their home stood on the outskirts of Fort Louis. Their daughter, Marie Rivard, was born in the autumn of 1705. Historian J. Higginbotham would even go so far as to say that their union would have far-reaching repercussions in the political and social history of Louisiana, although I'm not fully clear about what exactly those would be. But Marie was one of 23 young ladies from France who'd come to the New World, to Louisiana, to find a husband. These girls, because they'd all come from France aboard the Pelican, would be known to all posterity as the Pelican Girls. And they were the first such group of several groups of women who would be known collectively as the Cassette Girls or the Casket Girls, those who came both to Mobile and later to New Orleans. And each of these individual groups had its own story and circumstances. But this first group, as those who are first often are, were the pioneers and trailblazers for all the rest. These women, those who survived, were to become the mothers of Mobile. Many in the United States, especially in the Southeast, can trace their heritage to these courageous and perhaps a little naive in the beginning women who braved the unknown and ventured into French colonial America in search of their husbands and their future. This is their story. There's an old saying that when legend becomes bigger than the truth, print the legend. And frankly, much of what we know about the Pelican Girls is as much legend as it is documented truth. The story of the Pelican Girls, even when we know the facts, almost feels fictional because we're inclined to hear some of it and say, there's no way that really happened. But in many cases, it really did. If much of the story is legend, then that's appropriate because these women were themselves legendary. To understand why Marie Briard and the other Pelican Girls were sent across the Atlantic, we first need to understand the precarious situation in French Louisiana at the beginning of the 18th century. France claimed an enormous territory in North America, an empire that stretched from Canada and the Great Lakes through the Mississippi Valley and down to the Gulf of Mexico. On a map, it was impressive. On the ground, however, the French presence along the Gulf Coast was tenuous at best. The first French settlement in the region had been established at Fort Maurepas near present-day Ocean Springs, Mississippi in 1699. 3 years later, Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville and his younger brother Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville established Fort Louis on 27 Mile Bluff overlooking the Mobile River. Fort Louis became the capital of French Louisiana. But calling it a capital makes it sound far grander than it really was. This wasn't Paris or Quebec. It wasn't even Havana. It was a struggling frontier settlement comprised mainly of a rotting wooden fort and a scattering of crude houses beside the Mobile River. The colony faced threats from nearly every direction. France was at war with England, and English traders from Carolina were steadily extending their influence among the Native American nations of the Southeast. Spain controlled nearby Pensacola and regarded French expansion along the Gulf Coast with suspicion. Supplies from France arrived irregularly, when they arrived at all. But the colony's problems extended beyond food, fortifications, and foreign enemies. French Louisiana was populated overwhelmingly by men. Many of those men were French Canadians, including soldiers, hunters, fur traders, and wandering woodsmen. They were tough, independent, and accustomed to surviving far beyond the settled limits of French society. Those qualities made them useful on the frontier, but they did not necessarily make them obedient subjects of Louis XIV. They often spent months at a time living and trading among indigenous peoples. They formed economic alliances, personal relationships, and, in some cases, families within native communities. Some married indigenous women according to native customs. Others maintained relationships that French civil and religious authorities regarded simply as concubinage. To men such as Iberville and Bienville, this presented an imperial problem as much as a moral one. A Canadian who established his closest relationships among the native peoples might eventually feel greater loyalty to his wife's family and community than to France. A man who could disappear into the woods whenever colonial authority became inconvenient was difficult to govern. A colony comprised almost entirely of transient men couldn't create a stable population of French families and French-born children. If Louisiana was to become a permanent French colony, it needed women. Iberville and Bienville understood this. They repeatedly asked the French government to send families, and in particular, unmarried French women who could become wives for the men already living in the colony. That request traveled through the Comte de Pontchartrain. Pontchartrain was responsible for administering France's navy and its overseas colonies. To him and the royal government, these women represented far more than prospective wives. They were instruments of colonial policy. The women were expected to anchor Frenchmen to permanent households. They'd reinforce French culture and the Catholic faith. They'd bear children who would grow up as French subjects. They'd help transform an isolated military and trading post into an enduring French society. The government's intentions were made remarkably clear in its instructions to Bienville. His Majesty sends by that ship 20 girls to be married to the Canadians and others who've begun habitations at Mobile in order that this colony can firmly establish itself. These young women were being recruited as brides, mothers, laborers, religious examples, and agents of French imperial expansion. The future of the colony was being placed, at least in part, upon their shoulders, although few of them could have understood exactly what they were being asked to undertake. The responsibility for finding them fell to Saint-Vallier, the Bishop of Quebec. His diocese extended across an almost unimaginable portion of French North America, including the infant settlements of Louisiana. In July 1703, he formally recognized Fort Louis as a separate parish. He understood that the colony needed clergy and that it needed French families. At the request of the government and upon Iberville's recommendation, Saint-Vallier began searching the convents and religious communities in and around Paris for suitable young women. Now, the word convent may create the wrong impression for modern listeners. These young women weren't necessarily nuns, nor were they all impoverished orphans rescued from the streets of Paris. Some convents also served as schools and residences where daughters from respectable families received instruction and were raised under religious supervision. Higginbotham records that several of the women were of comparatively high birth. These convents might be appropriately understood almost as finishing schools. Saint-Vallier wasn't searching merely for women willing to go. He was looking for young women whose character would satisfy the requirements of church and crown, Catholic, unmarried, respectable, industrious, and above all, virtuous. The bishop interviewed prospective candidates and presented Louisiana as a land of extraordinary promise. There, they were told they'd have opportunities unavailable to them in France. They could choose husbands from among the brave Frenchmen establishing a new colony for king and country. They could become the founding women of a new society. And Louisiana, Saint-Vallier apparently assured them, was the promised land. That wasn't merely a later embellishment added to make the bishop appear deceitful. Bienville himself would report that the women later grumbled against the Bishop of Quebec because he'd made them understand that they were coming to the promised land. The contrast between that promise and the conditions awaiting them could hardly have been greater. Saint-Vallier and the other French officials knew, or certainly should have known, that Fort Louis was not a paradise. The colony had repeatedly faced hunger. Its buildings were crude and already decaying in the damp Gulf Coast climate. Its streets and gardens frequently stood in water. Disease was a constant danger. Supplies were scarce. Many of the men refused to plant crops, preferring instead to hunt, trade, or disappear into the woods for months at a time. The bishop didn't tell the women that. Nor apparently did he emphasize that most of their prospective husbands weren't polished gentlemen from France. They were Canadians, soldiers, artisans, traders, and backwoodsmen whom polite French society often regarded as coarse provincials. The women were told that they could choose their husbands, and that portion of the promise was substantially true. They wouldn't be simply handed to men at random. Marriage contracts would be negotiated, property provisions established, and ceremonies conducted by priests. But a choice from among a few dozen men in an isolated colony thousands of miles from France wasn't quite the freedom the promise suggested. Once the women reached Louisiana, there'd be no way to return home. They could select from among the available men, but they couldn't go back. 20 young women were initially selected, most reportedly between 14 and 19 years old. Another joined them at Rochefort. 2 additional unmarried daughters traveling with families aboard the ship brought the number of prospective brides to 23. And so, in October 1703, the first group departed Paris in wagons and began the approximately 300-mile journey to Rochefort on France's Atlantic coast. They were leaving behind everything familiar, their homes, their families, and a country they'd likely never see again. Ahead of them waited a wooden chest containing a few belongings, an ocean they'd never crossed, men they'd never met, and a promised land that existed primarily in the empty promises of a bishop. The journey from Paris to Rochefort was itself no small undertaking. The women traveled approximately 300 miles in wagons over the roads of early 18th century France. For young women accustomed to the comparatively sheltered environment of religious schools and convents, the trip may have offered their first real taste of the discomforts awaiting them. But when they reached Rochefort, there was no ship waiting to carry them immediately to Louisiana. France was then engaged in the War of the Spanish Succession, another of the long and enormously expensive conflicts that repeatedly pitted Louis XIV against much of Europe. England's strength at sea made any French voyage across the Atlantic dangerous, while the demands of the war placed a more enormous pressure on the ships, sailors, soldiers, money, and supplies available to the French government. The women who'd left Paris expecting to continue quickly to the New World instead remained at Rochefort for months. And while they waited, they began hearing things. Sailors and others familiar with Louisiana spoke of the poverty and hardships at Fort Louis. The men awaiting the women weren't the polished French patriots that they'd been led to imagine. Many were French Canadians, men the sailors reportedly described as Canadian barbarians. The women had been raised to understand the distinctions of family, class, and social position. Some came from respectable and perhaps even comparatively prominent families. They trusted the bishop's assurances that suitable husbands awaited them in the land of opportunity. Now, for the first time, they began to suspect that they hadn't been told the whole truth. Some reportedly wanted to abandon the expedition and return home. That possibility alarmed those responsible for delivering the women to Louisiana. If one left, others might follow. If the families learned what their daughters were hearing, the entire plan could collapse before the ship ever left France. Access to the women was restricted, and their contact with sailors and other people around the port was limited. According to the traditional account, officials attempted to reassure and distract them with entertainment, gifts, and increased allowances. It was also at Rochefort that the women reportedly received the small wooden traveling chests that became so closely associated with their story. These were the cassettes from which the later expression cassette girls would develop. The chests were small enough to be carried and contained the few belongings the women could take into their new lives. We don't have a surviving inventory telling us precisely what each woman placed inside hers, but what we can say is that these small chests became powerful symbols of the women themselves. Each woman was being asked to leave behind her family, her country, and almost everything she'd ever known. What she could carry in that one wooden box represented the small portion of her old life that would accompany her into the new one. While the women waited, preparations for the expedition continued. The ship selected for the voyage was the Pelican, an armed French vessel carrying 56 guns. It wasn't designed as a comfortable passenger ship. It would carry approximately 75 soldiers, officers, sailors, priests, missionaries, artisans, and several families, along with livestock, food, merchandise, and other supplies desperately needed in Louisiana. 21 prospective brides gathered at Paris, and Rochefort would be joined by 2 unmarried daughters traveling with families aboard the ship, bringing the number of prospective brides to 23. If one small island can hold this many stories, just imagine what's waiting across an entire state. This is Big John Summers, and when I'm not exploring Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, and the Gulf Coast, I'm traveling Tennessee in search of the people, places, and events that shaped the volunteer state. On the Tennessee History Nerd, you'll hear stories ranging from the Scopes monkey trial and the Battle of Athens to the Sultana disaster, the lost state of Franklin, forgotten communities, historic battlefields, and much more. You'll hear full-length conversations with historians, authors, local experts, and people preserving Tennessee's history. For the same boots-on-the-ground storytelling you enjoy here, search for the Tennessee History Nerd and follow it in your favorite podcast app. And now, let's get back to the story. The full number of women aboard the ship was actually larger. Marie-Francoise de Bourrineau accompanied the girls as their governess and protector. 2 nursing sisters, Marie Grisseau and Marie Lenant, were also aboard, as were women traveling with their families. In all, the Pelican carried 27 female passengers, but not all 27 were Pelican Girls. The expedition also included Father Levant, the priest who was assigned to the new parish at Fort Louis, and Alexander Houff, another priest assigned to serve in Louisiana. Pierre-Charles Lesueur, an experienced French-Canadian explorer and trader who knew many of the men awaiting the women, also joined the voyage. Iberville had intended also to sail with them, but illness prevented him from making the journey. Instead, command of the Pelican rested with Captain Ducoudray. By the time the ship was loaded, it was packed far beyond anything resembling comfort. Higginbotham describes the vessel as exorbitantly overloaded. It carried so much cargo and so many people that some members of the crew had no proper place to sleep. The women were assigned cramped private quarters and were to be kept separated from the officers, soldiers, and sailors as much as possible. That separation wasn't merely a matter of convenience. Pontchartrain and other officials had issued strict orders that the women's virtue and reputations were to be protected. They'd been carefully selected as respectable prospective wives for the men of Louisiana. The French government had no intention of allowing them to become attached to sailors, soldiers, or anyone else before reaching their intended destination. Protecting them would be the responsibility of Marie Francois de Boisrenaud, the two nursing nuns, Father Levant, and Captain Ducoudray. It would prove to be no easy assignment aboard an overcrowded ship filled principally with men facing a voyage of several months. Finally, on April 19, 1704, approximately 6 months after the women had left Paris, the Pelican sailed from Rochefort. The coast of France disappeared behind them. Whatever doubts the women had developed during the long delay, it was now too late to act upon them. They'd entrusted themselves to the promises of the bishop, the protection of the French government, and the uncertain mercy of the Atlantic Ocean. Ahead lay thousands of miles of open water, and beyond that water waited 27 Mile Bluff, Fort Louis, and the husbands they were crossing an ocean to find. For all the uncertainty surrounding their destination, the first part of the voyage proved to be comparatively uneventful. The Atlantic was unusually calm. Father Levant would describe the Pelican as the most easy-riding ship in the world, a fortunate quality for a vessel so heavily burdened that it regularly took on water and lacked sufficient sleeping space for some of its crew. Even an easy-riding ship, however, was enough to leave many of its passengers miserable. Alexander Hoover became seasick repeatedly, and the young women suffered their own persistent bouts of nausea. Most had never been to sea before, and now they found themselves confined for weeks inside cramped quarters aboard an overloaded ship rolling upon the Atlantic. Their seclusion did not prevent all contact with the other passengers. Pierre-Charles Lesueur became one of the most popular figures aboard the Pelican. He was an experienced explorer, trader, and storyteller who had traveled extensively through French North America. More importantly to the women, he knew Louisiana. And he knew many of the men that they were going there to marry. The women eagerly sought whatever information he might provide. What did Fort Louis look like? What kind of homes awaited them? Which men possessed property? Which held positions of authority? Which might prove kind, respectable, or capable of supporting a family? Lesueur could speak with authority about Louisiana and many of its inhabitants, although he had not personally seen the completed settlement at 27 Mile Bluff. Even so, his stories offered the women their first opportunity to compare the bishop's promises with the observations of someone who'd actually lived along the Gulf Coast. Their interest in Lesueur didn't please everyone. Father Levant regarded the rough French-Canadian explorer with considerable suspicion and little affection. Levant was frequently ill, increasingly irritable, and deeply conscious of the enormous responsibility placed upon him. That responsibility included protecting the women from the officers, soldiers, and sailors aboard ship. Levant later admitted that he'd always considered the supervision of the young women an onerous work. The prolonged voyage did nothing to make it easier. The women had been selected in part because of their reputed virtue, and the French government expected them to arrive in Louisiana with both their virtue and their reputations intact. Pontchartrain and other officials had therefore ordered that the women remain in their private quarters and that their interaction with the men be closely controlled. Captain Ducoudray supported those restrictions with the authority Levant himself sometimes lacked. The precautions were not unnecessary. The Pelican was crowded with men who had been at sea for weeks, while the young women were close at hand. Nevertheless, the women reached the Caribbean without the scandal French officials had feared. A violent storm struck as the Pelican approached Cap-Français. The ship was close enough to port to offer the tantalizing sight of safety, but the narrow entrance to the harbor was too dangerous to attempt in the storm. Captain Ducoudray kept the vessel outside throughout the night until the weather subsided. On the morning of June 10th, 52 or 53 days after leaving Rochefort, the Pelican finally entered the harbor at Cap-Français. For the officers, sailors, and male passengers, the stop offered a welcome respite after nearly 2 months aboard ship. They went ashore, visited the town, and enjoyed the temporary comforts of solid ground. The women, however, remained aboard. Local men made repeated requests that they be allowed to come ashore. Father Levant believed at least some of those men hoped to persuade several women to remain in Saint-Domingue rather than continuing to Louisiana. The government had selected them specifically for Fort Louis, however, and Captain Ducoudray refused to release them. The decision was practical from the government's perspective, but particularly cruel from the women's. They had endured nearly 2 months of seasickness and confinement. Now land lay plainly before them while the men left the ship and moved freely through the town. The women could only remain within the same cramped quarters and wait. After 7 days at Cap-Français, the men returned aboard. On June 17th, the Pelican again raised sail and continued westward. During the first days of July, the weather deteriorated. Thunderstorms followed the ship as it moved along the northern coast of Cuba. On July 3rd, the Pelican entered one of the most dangerous passages of the voyage. Wind and waves battered its starboard side. The sails strained against the masts, and for most of the night the ship tossed violently in the darkness. The young women, already exhausted from weeks of nausea and confinement, became increasingly sick. For hours, the Pelican barely held its course. By the following morning, the wind and waves finally began to subside. The battered ship continued westward along the Cuban coast, and on the afternoon of July 7th, the formidable walls, towers, and churches of Havana rose ahead of them. Havana was unlike anything the women had seen since leaving France. Founded by the Spanish nearly 2 centuries before, it was already one of the most important cities in the Americas. The city was smaller than the great European centers the women had known or imagined, but after 11 weeks aboard the Pelican, Havana must have appeared magnificent. More importantly, the women were finally permitted to go ashore. The Bishop of Cuba received them with what Father Levant described as charity and magnificence. He arranged for them to stay in comfortable quarters adjoining his residence in a building used as a school for girls. Levant wrote that the bishop received them as if in a convent, supporting and entertaining them at his own expense. For the first time since leaving Rochefort, the women could sleep on solid ground. They could move without feeling the deck roll beneath their feet. They could breathe air that had not first passed through the close quarters of an overcrowded ship. For 4 or 5 days, the bishop and other members of Havana's religious community showed them the city's churches, convents, shrines, and gardens. After being denied permission to leave the ship at Cap-Français, the freedom and hospitality they experienced in Havana must have seemed all the more extraordinary. It was the brightest portion of their journey. It was also where the voyage turned deadly. Havana's beauty concealed conditions that made it an ideal breeding ground for mosquitoes. Low, swampy areas surrounded portions of the city, while stagnant water collected in ditches along its narrow streets. The weather was hot, humid, and oppressive, particularly after the cooler area of the Atlantic. At night, the mosquitoes descended upon the visitors. The soldiers complained of their incessant humming and biting, as did the women. Louis-Francois Lefebvre was remembered as having complained repeatedly about the bites. No one aboard the Pelican understood the danger. The connection between mosquitoes and yellow fever would not be established for nearly another 200 years. To the women, the mosquitoes were simply another discomfort, annoying, persistent, and seemingly harmless. During the ship's 8 days in Havana, Captain Ducoudray took on fresh water and additional supplies. Father Levant even purchased a milk cow and had it loaded aboard the already overcrowded vessel. Ducoudray also conducted business of his own, selling flour and other merchandise despite Spanish restrictions on foreign trade. But as the Pelican prepared to leave, signs of trouble began. One officer and several soldiers developed fevers. Le Sieur, the experienced explorer whose stories had entertained the passengers and given the women information about Louisiana, became dangerously ill. His condition deteriorated so rapidly that he couldn't continue the voyage and had to be left behind in Havana. The others returned to the ship on July 14th. The women once again entered the cramped quarters they had so gratefully escaped a week earlier. The walls and towers of Havana receded behind them as the Pelican entered the Gulf of Mexico. Their destination was now perhaps only a week away. The long Atlantic Passage was behind them. Fort Louis, their prospective husbands, and the future they had been promised lay just across the Gulf. But the Pelican had taken on more than water and provisions in Havana. The fever was already aboard. The podcast lets me tell you the story, but what if you could come along and see the places where that story happened? For just 99 cents a month, Dauphin Island Diaries Facebook subscribers receive exclusive videos and bonus content from my travels around the island, Mobile Bay, and the Gulf Coast. You'll get a closer look at historic locations, local attractions, interviews, and other material that takes you beyond what you hear in the podcast. Your subscription also helps to support the travel, research, and fieldwork that make Dauphin Island Diaries possible. Visit the Dauphin Island Diaries page on Facebook, tap the subscribe button, and come explore with me. And now, let's get back to the story. Shortly after leaving Havana, the sickness began. Crewmen complained of chills, headaches, and severe pain in their backs and joints. Fevers spread rapidly among the sailors and soldiers. By the following morning, an officer had already died and was hastily buried at sea. The illness soon reached the women's quarters. Several of the girls became sick, including Louise Francois Lefebvre, who developed fever and headache. What had begun with seemingly harmless mosquito bites in Havana was now becoming an epidemic aboard the ship. Back in Cuba, Le Sieur died in Havana on July 17th, 3 days after the Pelican departed, and was buried in the parish church there. The passengers sailing toward Louisiana would not learn of his death for months. On July 22nd, the ship finally entered the harbor at Massacre Island. What the passengers saw offered little encouragement. Instead of a thriving colonial port, Massacre Island contained little more than a small warehouse, several crude cabins, and a handful of men. It was a desolate contrast to the walls, churches, and gardens of Havana. But disappointment quickly gave way to catastrophe. Nearly 60 of the Pelican's soldiers and crewmen were feverish when the ship arrived. Some had fallen into delirium. As soon as the sick were brought ashore, they began dying. 4 men from one company died, followed by 2 from another. During the next several days, at least 8 more soldiers succumbed as well. The dead were buried quickly while Father Levant and Alexander Hoover struggled to minister to the sick. The women could not immediately continue to Fort Louis. The Pelican was far too large to travel up Mobile Bay and up the Mobile River to 27 Mile Bluff, and the few small boats at Massacre Island couldn't carry all the passengers and supplies. Worse, Bienville had received little warning that the ship was approaching. Only 2 suitable transport boats were available at Fort Louis, and they didn't reach Massacre Island until July 27th. By then, at least 14 soldiers had died on the island. Several of the young women were also ill. Louise Francois was nearly delirious. July 28th was spent loading the 2 boats. The work moved slowly because so few members of the Pelican's crew remained healthy enough to help. The following day, the boats departed Massacre Island, loaded nearly beyond capacity with passengers. Approximately 55 miles still separated the women from Fort Louis. For 2 days, the crowded boats moved slowly northward through Mobile Bay. They entered the Mobile River on July 31st and continued upstream toward 27 Mile Bluff. By the end of the following day, August 1st, 1704, the settlement finally came into view. A wooden fort stood upon the bluff above the river. Below and around it, approximately 80 crude houses stretched along damp streets and waterlogged gardens. The settlement was larger than the lonely outpost at Massacre Island, but it bore little resemblance to the promised land the women had crossed an ocean to find. Bienville and the men of Fort Louis gathered along the riverbank to greet them. The women arrived pale, exhausted, and feverish, barely able to smile at the men who had waited so long to see them. The soldiers accompanying them were in even worse condition. Many were only 14 or 15 years old, and nearly all were sick. The journey from Paris had lasted approximately 10 months. The women had traveled 300 miles across France, spent 6 months waiting at Rochefort, crossed the Atlantic, survived storms and sickness, endured a yellow fever epidemic, and completed the final 55 miles in 2 dangerously crowded boats. They had reached Fort Louis. For Louise Francois Lefebvre, the journey had lasted just long enough. She was carried to the priest's quarters after arriving at the settlement. Following a night of delirium and vomiting, she died on the morning of August 2nd and was buried later that day. The remaining women had survived. Now they had to build lives in the place that they'd been deceived into calling paradise. The courtships began almost immediately. Some of the women were temporarily lodged with established families at Fort Louis. Others stayed in houses belonging to men who were away hunting or traveling on colonial business. Accommodations were limited, but Bienville did not expect the arrangement to last long. The women had been sent to Louisiana to marry, and the bachelors of Fort Louis had been waiting eagerly for them. The selection process was more deliberate than the familiar image of women simply stepping ashore and being paired with whichever men happened to be available. Marie-Françoise Brarenaud took seriously her responsibility to see that the women made suitable matches. Even before reaching Fort Louis, she and the girls had gathered information from Le Sueur and other Louisiana veterans. Once at the settlement, they'd learned more from Bienville, Father Levant, and the people already living there. Approximately 50 or 60 unmarried men were available, but Higginbotham estimates that only about 40 received serious consideration, and perhaps only 25 were regarded as genuinely good prospects. The first consideration was a man's ability to provide for a wife. His position within the colony also mattered, along with his age, health, appearance, and temperament. The women may have crossed an ocean to find husbands, but they didn't intend to accept them blindly. The men were evaluating the women as well. Some of the young women were considered more desirable because of their appearance, their personalities, or family backgrounds. Some of the Canadian men appeared to regard them less as individuals than as commodities sent from France. That awareness made some of the women cautious and perhaps deliberately distant. They had agreed to marry men they'd never met, but they still wanted to preserve as much dignity and control as circumstances allowed. Marie Briard soon attracted the attention of Antoine Rivard de Lavigne. Antoine came from a well-connected family and possessed greater means than many of the other Canadian men at Fort Louis. He was established in business and appeared capable of supporting a household, precisely the kind of practical consideration that mattered in a settlement where hunger was never very far away. Maria apparently found him acceptable, and Antoine began formally pursuing her. Other matches developed just as quickly. Louise Marguerite Husseau was courted by Guillaume Boutin, a Canadian merchant and cannoneer. Marie Catherine Christophe attracted René Boyer, a master gunsmith. Marguerite and Genevieve Burrell were courted by Claude Trepanier and Gilbert Dardenne, 2 Canadians of comparatively good means. By the beginning of the second week in August, a number of women had agreed to enter into marriage contracts. These contracts demonstrate that the marriages were not casual arrangements. Fathers Davion and Levant acted as notaries, drawing up agreements in the presence of the couples and their witnesses. Those who could write signed their names, others made their marks. Some places you visit Other places become part of who you are. If Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, and the Gulf Coast have become part of your story, you can show that connection with official Dauphin Island Diaries merchandise from Summers Media Enterprises. From shirts, hats, and mugs to even bumper stickers, there's a way to carry a little piece of the island wherever you go and help other people who love this special place recognize a fellow island enthusiast. Every purchase also helps support the research, travel, and storytelling behind Dauphin Island Diaries. Follow the merchandise link in this episode's description, find your favorite design, and let folks know that the island's stories matter to you. And now, let's get back to the story. Marie-Francois de Boisrenaud supervised the proceedings and helped to ensure that the women understood what they were agreeing to. The contracts included provisions governing property and inheritance. In some cases, mutual donation clauses ensured that if a husband died without children, his wife would retain rights to his property. That protection was no small matter in a colony where disease, warfare, and accidents could make any marriage unexpectedly brief. Marie Briard and Antoine Rivard entered into one of those contracts. Antoine was not merely gaining a wife. He was giving Marie legal rights in his estate and accepting obligations that restricted his own freedom. However unusual their courtship may have been, their marriage carried genuine legal and financial consequences for them both. The formal engagement was followed by several days of more concentrated courtship. Couples spent more time together and learned what they could about one another's habits and personalities. Families temporarily housing the women held modest celebrations with food, drink, music, and dancing. Then came the weddings. During the middle of August, ceremonies were held almost daily in the small chapel inside Fort Louis. By August 17th, only 16 days after the women arrived, 13 marriages had been performed. Marie Briard became Marie Rivard. She left her temporary lodging and went with Antoine to his house on the outskirts of the settlement along Doug Street. After 10 months of travel and uncertainty, the future for which she had crossed the Atlantic had begun. But not every woman married immediately. 8 of the prospective brides remained unmarried after the first ceremonies. Some were waiting for men of greater status or means. Several of the colony's most prominent bachelors, including Henry de Tonty, Charles Levasseur, Pierre Duc de Boisbriand, and Bienville himself, had not yet married. Several of the colony's most prominent bachelors, including Henry de Tonty, Charles Levasseur, Pierre Duc de Boisbriand, and Bienville himself, had not yet married. Other women were already formally promised, but had not yet completed their ceremonies. Then yellow fever returned. The disease brought aboard the Pelican had appeared to subside within the first weeks of August, but mosquitoes around Fort Louis had bitten the infected newcomers and then carried the virus to residents of the settlements. By late August, more than half the town was sick. Henry de Tonty and Charles Levasseur, apparently engaged to 2 of the newly arrived women, fell ill and died before their marriages could take place. 2 newlywed Pelican girls, Catherine Turant and Jean-Elisabeth Lepintieux, also contracted the fevers. Fathers Levant and Davion became sick, leaving few people capable of performing additional weddings. The celebrations stopped. The dancing ended. Courtships and marriage ceremonies were postponed while Fort Louis became a place of fever, fear, and death. Once again, the surviving women found themselves in a strange land, watching the people around them die. And even after the epidemic passed, they would discover that surviving Fort Louis required more than finding husbands. The epidemic eventually loosened its grip, but ordinary life at Fort Louis offered little relief. The marriages had given the women households of their own, or at least the beginnings of households, but marriage could not transform the settlement into the promised land that they'd been led to expect. Their husbands could provide only what the colony itself possessed, and Fort Louis possessed very little. Some of the men had comparatively comfortable homes by the standards of the settlement. A few, including Antoine Rivard-le-Dauphin, had the means and ambition to develop larger farms or plantations, but most of the houses were crude wooden structures with earthen floors and few furnishings. The damp climate quickly attacked anything made of wood. After heavy rains, water collected around the houses and remained there for weeks. The site chosen for Fort Louis was elevated above the river, but much of the surrounding land was poorly drained. The gardens flooded. Roads became mud. Mosquitoes bred in the standing water, and even some of the French officials complained that the settlement had been placed too far upriver and upon unsuitable ground. The women had been promised homes. What many of them received were frontier huts. And the men they married didn't always share their understanding of what a home should be. Many of the Canadians had spent much of their adult lives hunting, trading, and traveling through the forests. They were accustomed to leaving the settlements for extended periods. Some had long-standing relationships within indigenous communities, and later accounts claim that certain husbands continued to return to indigenous wives or companions after marrying French women. The extent of that practice is difficult to measure, but the broader conflict is clear. The French government had sent the women to bind the men to the permanent households. The habits that made these men effective hunters and traders were the same habits that made domestic stability difficult to achieve. The women had crossed the Atlantic expecting their husbands to establish homes and provide for families. Many of the men still preferred the woods to the fields. That distinction was of consequence because Fort Louis remained dangerously dependent upon food obtained from elsewhere. Supplies from France were unreliable. The colony occasionally purchased provisions from Veracruz or Havana, but those voyages were expensive and hazardous. The settlers also relied heavily upon food obtained through trade with neighboring indigenous peoples. Without indigenous maize, the French settlement might not have survived at all. Some colonists planted gardens, and a few more prosperous men attempted larger agricultural operations, but farming at Fort Louis was difficult. The poorly drained soil frustrated cultivation. Tools and draft animals were scarce. The colony possessed no working mills, so grain had to be crushed by hand in wooden mortars. And many of the men simply didn't want to farm. They'd come to Louisiana as soldiers, traders, hunters, and adventurers, not as peasants. They'd been drawn by the possibility of wealth, trade, and advancement. Planting gardens, grinding grain, and tending fields offered none of the romance they'd expected from the New World. The consequence was another shortage of food. The men who'd lived in Louisiana for several years had learned to eat maize, what we call corn, prepared in the ways available to them. The newly arrived women had not. For the Pelican Girls, most of whom had been raised in or near Paris, maize was unfamiliar and unwelcome. Bread made from wheat had been a basic part of their diet in France. Now wheat was scarce, there was no mill, and the food upon which their survival depended was a grain many of them regarded as fit only for animals or the poor. This was more than simple fussiness over an unfamiliar food. It represented everything they'd lost. They'd left France believing they were going to a land of abundance. Instead, they were living in crude houses, surrounded by stagnant water, struggling against disease, and depending upon indigenous farmers for the maize their own husbands often refused to grow. The women complained, and this portion of the story is firmly documented. Bienville reported that the men of Louisiana were becoming accustomed to maize, but that the women, who for the most part are natives of Paris, were very reluctant to eat it. Their unhappiness, he wrote, caused them to grumble against the Bishop of Quebec, who'd led them to understand that they were coming to the Promised Land. These words bring the women's own voices tantalizingly close to us. The surviving records seldom tell us what any particular Pelican Girl thought or said. They don't preserve Marie Briard's private reaction to her new home or record the conversations that passed between the women. But Bienville's report established that they compared the reality of Fort Louis with Saint-Valier's promises, and they knew they'd been deceived. Their complaints eventually became associated with one of the most memorable episodes in the history of colonial Mobile, the Petticoat Rebellion. According to the traditional account, the women acted collectively. If their husbands wouldn't build suitable homes and provide adequate food, the women would deny these husbands the comforts of marriage. The men would receive neither bed nor board until conditions improved. In its fullest form, the story becomes an organized marital strike. The women barred their husbands from their homes and refused marital relations until the men agreed to cultivate the land and make the settlement more livable. Bienville supposedly found himself caught between angry Parisian women and equally frustrated Canadian men. His patience severely tested by a domestic rebellion he had no obvious power to suppress. It's a wonderful story, and its essential point is entirely consistent with the conditions at Fort Louis. But we should distinguish between what the earliest surviving documents establish and what later tradition added to the account. Bienville's own report confirms that the women resisted eating maize, bitterly complained about the promised land they'd been promised, and directed their anger toward Saint-Vallier. It confirms the grievance underlying the rebellion. The more colorful details, the coordinated refusal of bed and board, the husbands being locked out, and the women presenting a united list of demands, appear more clearly in later retellings. Peter Hamilton included the Petticoat Rebellion in colonial Mobile, although he even introduced it cautiously with the words, "It is said." That doesn't necessarily mean the rebellion never happened. Stories preserved within families and communities may retain events that official correspondence ignored or reduced to a few dismissive lines. Colonial administrators were far more likely to record shortages, shipments, and military affairs than the domestic strategies employed by a group of dissatisfied wives. But it does mean that we can't reconstruct the rebellion as though someone had preserved minutes of its meetings. Whatever its precise form, the conflict represented a serious contest over what French Louisiana was going to become. The men had grown accustomed to surviving through hunting, trading, and indigenous assistance. The women had been sent specifically to create permanent French households. They couldn't fulfill the role assigned to them by the crown, bearing and raising French families, if their husbands disappeared into the woods while their homes flooded and their children faced hunger. The protest was therefore not simply the tantrum of pampered young women who refused to eat corn. It was a demand that the colony begin functioning as the government claimed it wanted it to function. If France expected these women to become wives, mothers, and builders of a permanent society, then the men would have to become husbands, fathers, and providers. Later accounts say that the women prevailed. Their husbands began improving their homes and paying greater attention to gardens and food production. The transformation was neither immediate nor complete, but the women had demonstrated that they were not passive instruments of French colonial policy. They crossed the Atlantic under the authority of bishops, ministers, priests, and naval officers. They'd been selected, supervised, transported, and presented to the men of Louisiana as prospective wives. But once at Fort Louis, they discovered a form of power of their own. The government wanted children. The men wanted wives. The colony needed stable households. And the women understood that none of those things could be accomplished without their cooperation. Bienville was reportedly exasperated. He asked that any future brides sent to Louisiana be hardworking countrywomen better prepared for the frontier life. That judgment, while perhaps understandable from Bienville's perspective, wasn't entirely fair. The Pelican Girls may not have arrived with the agricultural experience needed to make crops flourish in unfamiliar climates. They may indeed have resisted food they'd never expected to eat, but they'd endured months of uncertainty in Rochefort, an Atlantic crossing aboard an overcrowded ship, confinement, storms, seasickness, and an epidemic that killed people all around them. They'd reached a primitive settlement, married strangers, and begun creating households thousands of miles from everyone they'd ever known. They weren't objecting because frontier life was insufficiently elegant. They were objecting because the conditions at Fort Louis were insufficiently survivable. And if the story of the Petticoat Rebellion has grown in the telling, it grew around a documented truth. The women had been promised paradise, found hardship and disease instead, and refused to suffer the difference silently. The Pelican Girls weren't the only women willing to challenge Bienville. Marie-Françoise de Boireau had crossed the Atlantic as the women's governess and protector. She had investigated the prospective husbands, advised the younger women, and ensured that they understood the marriage contracts placed before them. But she'd never been one of the prospective brides herself. Within about 2 months of the Pelican's arrival, every surviving woman who'd come to Louisiana seeking a husband had married. Marie-Françoise alone remained unmarried. Not because no one wanted her, but because she didn't consider the available men suitable. Her background helps explain why. Before coming to Louisiana, Marie-Françoise had been associated with the Abbey of Fontevraud, one of the oldest and most prestigious religious institutions in France. Through that association, Marie-Françoise entered a social world far removed from the crude houses and Canadian backwoodsmen of Fort Louis. She was educated, socially connected, and evidently conscious of her position. Bienville reported that several Canadians were interested in marrying her, but Marie-Françoise refused them. She considered her noble background incompatible with the men available in the colony. That attitude irritated Bienville. The entire purpose of sending unmarried women to Louisiana was to produce marriages and families. From his perspective, Marie-Françoise had brought the younger women to Fort Louis, supervised their courtships, and then refused to do what she had encouraged them to do. Yet she was too useful and too popular for Bienville simply to cast her aside. After her responsibilities toward the brides ended, Marie-Françoise began teaching. She instructed indigenous women and children, assisted with baptisms, and gave lessons to the daughters of the French inhabitants. At a time when Fort Louis possessed almost nothing resembling a formal school, she became one of the settlement's first educators. She also became an increasingly vocal critic of Bienville's administration. Fort Louis was a small community, but it was not a harmonious one. Personal rivalries and political factions divided its officers, priests, merchants, and inhabitants. Bienville clashed repeatedly with Nicolas de La Salle, the colony's commissary, over supplies, finances, and the management of Louisiana. Almost every hardship became another subject in their struggle for influence. Marie-Françoise aligned herself with La Salle and the seminary priests. Her criticism of Bienville grew sharper as poverty continued and supplies remained scarce. She complained openly that he lacked the qualities necessary to govern the colony. Bienville, in turn, came to regard her not merely as a difficult unmarried woman, but as a potentially dangerous political opponent. Then she fell in love with one of his closest officers. In February 1705, Pierre-Duc Boisbriand led a French party accompanying a Chickasaw delegation through Choctaw territory. The mission ended disastrously. The Choctaw attacked and massacred most of the Chickasaw men, and Boisbriand was wounded in the fighting. When he was carried back to Fort Louis, Marie-Françoise undertook his care. Eventually, he asked Marie-Françoise to marry him. At last, she had found a Canadian she considered worthy of her. Boisbriand was not merely another hunter or wandering trader. He was Bienville's cousin and the king's lieutenant. He came from the prominent Le Moyne family network and held a, 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 For Marie-Françoise, this may have appeared to be the marriage she had refused to settle for until then, a union based not merely upon necessity, but upon affection and mutual respect. Bienville opposed it. His objection does not appear to have been based on Boisbriand's inability to provide for a wife, nor could he reasonably complain that Marie-Françoise was refusing to marry a Canadian. She had finally accepted one of the most eligible Canadians in the colony. The problem was political. By then, Marie Francois had become one of Bienville's most outspoken critics. Boisbriand was one of his most important officers and trusted supporters. A marriage between them would bring Bienville's political opponent into the family and place her beside a man who occupied a vital position in the colony's administration. Bienville and his brother pressured Boisbriand to abandon the marriage. Eventually, he yielded. Marie Francois did not. She remained at Fort Louis, but she never married. The broken engagement permanently destroyed whatever remained of her relationship with Bienville. From that point forward, she became an even more determined supporter of La Salle and an unrelenting critic of the commandant. She had crossed the Atlantic as the guardian of women whose choices were tightly restricted by the needs of the French crown. She had helped those women negotiate marriages under circumstances that made remaining single extraordinarily difficult. Yet when the same colonial pressure was directed toward her, she resisted it. Her story complicates the familiar description of the Pelican Girls as young brides passively delivered to Louisiana. Marie Francois was neither passive nor easily controlled. She advised marriages, educated children, entered colonial politics, criticized the commandant, and refused to marry merely because the government expected it. Nor was she the only Pelican woman whose life extended far beyond her arrival at Fort Louis. The marriages of 1704 soon began producing the permanent families the French government had wanted. During the summer and autumn of 1705, children were born throughout the settlement. Marie and Antoine Rivard de la Vigne had welcomed a daughter, Marie Rivard, that autumn. Marguerite and Gilbert Dardenne also had a daughter. Children were born to several other couples formed after the Pelicans' arrival. Until then, French Louisiana had been primarily a collection of soldiers, officers, missionaries, traders, and adventurers. The colony existed largely because the Crown continued supplying it and indigenous peoples continued feeding it. The children born after the arrival of the Pelican Girls belonged to Louisiana in a different way. For them, Fort Louis was not an overseas assignment or an uncertain adventure. It was home. Their mothers had been born in France and many of their fathers in Canada, but the children themselves were born along the Gulf Coast. They represented the beginning of a permanent French colonial population. The government had created the policy. The bishop had recruited the women. The Pelican had carried them across the Atlantic. Bienville had received them at Fort Louis. The women themselves had to survive the voyage, the epidemic, the marriages, the hunger, and the reality of building families in a place almost entirely unprepared to receive them. And the colony they helped create would not remain at 27 Mile Bluff for much longer. The same flooding, poor drainage, and difficulty transporting supplies that had tormented the settlement from its beginning eventually forced the French to reconsider its location. In 1711, Fort Louis and the capital of French Louisiana was moved downriver to the site of present-day Mobile. The Pelican Girls, who remained in the colony, moved with it. They had arrived at one Mobile and helped establish another. Their children and grandchildren spread throughout French Louisiana, carrying names that became woven into the history of Mobile, New Orleans, and the broader Gulf Coast. The king had sent the women to make the colony permanent. Against extraordinary odds, that's precisely what they did. The arrival of the Pelican did not end France's effort to send women to Louisiana. As the colony expanded, other groups followed. Women arrived at Biloxi, and after New Orleans was founded in 1718, still more were sent there. Some came voluntarily in search of opportunity or marriage. Others were recruited from hospitals, poorhouses, or correctional institutions under circumstances very different from those of the Pelican Girls. Over time, those separate groups became entangled in popular memory. The women who arrived at Mobile in 1704 were the Pelican Girls because they crossed the Atlantic aboard the Pelican. They were also associated with the small wooden chests, or cassettes, they'd reportedly received before leaving France. Later, women carrying similar chests became known as the Cassette Girls. In English, the name was commonly rendered as the Casket Girls. The Pelican Girls were the earliest group associated with the tradition, but their story belongs specifically to Mobile. That story has also become attached to another treasure piece of Gulf Coast history, the creation of gumbo. According to one popular account, the Pelican acquired okra while passing through the Caribbean. After the women reached Fort Louis, Madame Langlois, Benville's housekeeper, prepared a fish stew using local ingredients and knowledge she had gained from indigenous cooks. She added ground sassafras leaves, which the French called filet powder. The Pelican Girls supposedly suggested adding okra from the ship's cargo, and from that combination, gumbo was born. It's a marvelous story. It also can't presently be documented in that form. No known cargo inventory establishes that the Pelican brought okra to Mobile in 1704. No contemporary account records Madame Langlois preparing that particular meal or the Pelican Girls suggesting its final ingredient. The story appears in later tradition rather than in the surviving records of the voyage and settlement. But as with the Petticoat Rebellion, the legend grew around a larger historical truth. Gumbo did emerge from the meeting of cultures represented in early Louisiana. Indigenous peoples contributed ingredients and cooking knowledge, including the use of ground sassafras as a thickener. Africans and the people of African descent brought okra and West African culinary traditions through the Caribbean and into the Gulf Coast. French, Spanish, and other European settlers contributed their own methods, seasonings, and preferences. Gumbo didn't spring fully formed from one pot on one afternoon. It developed as people from different cultures adapted to the foods available along the Gulf Coast and learned from one another. That process was already taking place around Mobile Bay during the earliest years of the colony. The Pelican Girls entered that world when they stopped in Cuba, landed on Massacre Island, and traveled upriver to Fort Louis. Whether they personally helped create the first gumbo can't be proved, but they became part of the cultural exchange from which Gulf Coast cooking eventually emerged. The distinction matters because legend isn't necessarily the opposite of truth. A legend may preserve genuine memory while rearranging its details. It may attach a long historical development to one memorable person or event. It may tell us less about exactly what happened on a particular day than about what a community has chosen to remember. The danger comes only when we stop distinguishing between the story and the documentation. Much of the Pelican Girls account exists along that boundary. We know the Pelican sailed from Rochefort in April 1704. We know the names of the women aboard. We know the route the vessel followed, the epidemic that struck its passengers, and the date the women reached Fort Louis. We know that marriage contracts were negotiated, weddings performed, and children born. We know from Bienville's own report that the women complained bitterly about eating maize and blamed Saint-Vallier for persuading them that Louisiana was the promised land. Other details come to us through later histories and community tradition. The cassettes filled with bridal necessities similar to the hope chests of a later time. The coordinated refusal of bed and board, the creation of gumbo, and some of the more dramatic stories told about individual women. Those traditions shouldn't be discarded merely because a French official failed to write them down. The women of Fort Louis were not writing memoirs. Most were occupied with surviving pregnancy, childbirth, disease, hunger, and the daily labor of maintaining households in an isolated colony. Several couldn't even sign their own marriage contracts. The records that survive were written principally by the men who administered the colony, supplied it, defended it, and argued over control of it. Those men didn't necessarily consider the women's daily experiences worthy of preservation. The result is a story in which the official record gives us the names, dates, and transactions, while tradition attempts to restore voices, emotions, and human experience. We should handle those traditions honestly, but not contemptuously. The Pelican Girls' historical importance doesn't depend upon whether they invented gumbo or conducted a perfectly organized marital strike. Their documented accomplishment is remarkable enough. They survived a voyage lasting more than 3 months. They endured yellow fever before reaching Louisiana and another epidemic after their arrival. They married men they'd only known for a matter of days or weeks. They established households in a settlement where food was scarce, houses were crude, and reliable communication with France could disappear for more than a year at a time. They bore children and buried children. They watched husbands leave on trading expeditions, military missions, and voyages from which some never returned. They lived through colonial rivalries, warfare, hurricanes, epidemics, and the relocation of Mobile itself. And they created families. Their descendants became part of the population of Mobile and the wider Gulf Coast. Through marriages and migration, their family lines spread into Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and far beyond. More than 3 centuries later, people throughout the United States can trace their ancestry to women who arrived at Fort Louis in August 1704. That's why they're sometimes called the mothers of Mobile. The description should not obscure the indigenous women, enslaved African women, and other European women whose lives and labor also helped to create the city. Mobile had many mothers, and not all their names were preserved with equal care. But the Pelican Girls occupy a distinctive place in that history. They were the first organized company of French women sent to the Mobile colony expressly to establish families. Their arrival marked the point at which France's settlement began attempting to become something more than a remote military post and trading station. The government viewed them as instruments of empire. Saint-Vallier represented them with promises he couldn't fulfill. The men of Louisiana awaited them as wives. But the women became something more than any of those roles. They became settlers in their own right. Women who evaluated husbands, negotiated property rights, challenged living conditions, raised children, and helped shape the community into which they'd been deposited. The little cassettes they'd carried became symbols of their journey. Each box contained only what one woman could bring with her from France. Yet those women carried far more than personal possessions. They carried language, faith, customs, expectations, and memories of home. They carried the determination to demand something better than mere survival. And from those small boxes and those precarious households came families whose stories would continue for generations. In December 2025, a historical marker bearing the names of all 23 Pelican Girls was unveiled in downtown Mobile. It stands near the reconstructed Fort Conde and not far from the ground upon which the colonial city eventually developed. The marker is more than a list of names. It restores individual identities to women too often remembered only as a group. They weren't simply 23 interchangeable brides delivered to 23 waiting men. Each had a name, a family in France, a reason for accepting the journey, and a life that unfolded after she arrived. Some didn't survive to fulfill their intentions. Some portions of those lives can still be reconstructed. Others have disappeared into history. But collectively, their achievement remains visible in the city they helped make possible. The promised land they were promised didn't exist, so they helped build one. And that's going to do it for this episode of Dauphin Island Diaries, episode 10, A Pelican on the Bay, the story of the Pelican Girls. But we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode, and for that, we're going to look at the role of Mobile's shipyards in the nation's war effort in the World Wars in They Built Ghosts. And for next week's Interviews Day offering, I'll be sharing the interview I did recently with Bienville Bites food tour guide Bella Myers as we discussed the Pelican Girls, and some of what she and I discussed informed today's episode. And Bella also was instrumental in getting that historical marker for the Pelican Girls placed in downtown Mobile. So I hope you'll be watching for both of those to drop when we again explore where memories intermingle with the sand, the waves, and the wind. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, and these are Dauphin Island Diaries. May you enjoy fair winds today and a beautiful Dauphin Island sunset. So, as is my normal practice, before we finish up today, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the folks whose work informed today's episode. The principal source for this episode was J. Higginbotham's Old Mobile, Fort Louis de la Louisiane, 1702 to 1711. Higginbotham's exceptionally detailed account draws heavily upon surviving French, Spanish, and ecclesiastical records, including official correspondence, parish registers, marriage contracts, and reports written by Benville, Father Levant, and others who participated in the events described. I also consulted Peter J. Hamilton's Colonial Mobile. Hamilton's work preserves several important early traditions surrounding the Pelican Girls, including the story of the Petticoat Rebellion. However, because portions of his narrative are difficult to verify, I have relied upon Higginbotham's wherever the two accounts conflict and have treated Hamilton primarily as corroboration and evidence of how these stories were being told by the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Additional information came from the Encyclopedia of Alabama's article, The Pelican Girls, and from the chapter devoted to the women in Hidden History of Mobile. These sources were particularly helpful in tracing the later traditions associated with the women, although some of their more colorful details can't be confirmed through surviving contemporary records. I'm especially grateful to Mobile historian and Bienville Bites tour guide, Bella Myers, who generously shared her knowledge of the Pelican Girls with me during an extended interview recently. Bella also helped me to understand why these women remain so important to Mobile and why their story deserves a far more prominent place in the city's public memory. Her insight helped shape this episode, although any errors in the final account are mine. Where the historical record is firm, I've attempted to state the events as documented. Where surviving evidence is incomplete, I've identified details as tradition, later interpretation, or informed reconstruction. This is one of those situations where legend and myth intermingle with the historic record to a substantial degree, and so I'm especially thankful to those resources I've mentioned for their documentation of the historic record to the degree possible. And thanks so much to all of you for listening and for your support of the podcast. The best stories don't end when the episode does. They start conversations. If today's episode interested you, surprised you, or brought back a memory of your own, I'd love to hear from you. Use the Send Fan Mail link in the episode description or join the conversation on the Dauphin Island Diaries Facebook page. Send me your questions, share your memories, or tell me about a Gulf Coast story you think deserves to be told. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't keep it to yourself. Before you close your podcast app, share it with one person who loves Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, or Gulf Coast history and invite them to join us for the next story. Your voice can help preserve these stories and introduce them to someone new.